everyone. Welcome to this edition of WION-VOA Co-Production. I'm your host, Susan Tamprani, coming to you live from New York City. We begin with the Israel-Hamas war and the unconditional support of Israel by the United States. U.S. weapons sales to Israel have been under increased scrutiny amid outrage over the death of 33,000 people in Gaza, a figure that includes 7 aid workers killed in an Israeli airstrike this week. But as Voice of America's Patsy Widakuswara reports, the Biden administration is showing no signs of conditioning its military support to Israel.
A ship operated by aid group World Central Kitchen left Gaza and returned to Cyprus Wednesday, its food aid undelivered after Israeli airstrikes killed 7 of the charity group's workers, including a Canadian-American dual citizen, increasing demands that the Biden administration restrict its military aid to Israel. The White House shows no signs of doing so.
We are still supporting their right to defend themselves, and we're going to continue to do that. We're also going to see what the results of the investigation is. I'm not going to get ahead of decisions that haven't been made yet.
Israel is the largest recipient of U.S. aid, nearly $4 billion a year, most of it in military assistance. Under U.S. law, the administration must notify Congress of weapons transfer to Israel that's larger than $25 million. Since the October 7th Hamas attack, Congress has been notified of 4, said Josh Paul, former director at the State Department agency that handles weapons transfers.
2 of those were under the foreign military sales system, and both of those the Biden administration used an emergency authority to set aside the regular statutory congressional notification period. 2 of them have been via the direct commercial sales process and have been notified to Congress, but with less visibility because there is less information that is provided to the public on direct commercial sales.
In addition, a Department of Defense official who spoke to VOA under a condition of anonymity confirmed reporting by the Washington Post that since October 7th, over 100 arms transfers to Israel have taken place without informing Congress because the packages were structured to fall below the notification threshold.
When they are publicly saying that Israel needs to take more steps to protect civilians, but privately pushing through hundreds of millions of dollars worth of weapons, there's really no credibility when the Biden administration refuses to use the leverage that it does have. And the most significant source of leverage that the United States has is the massive amount of arms provided to Israel.
Since Harry Truman recognized Israel minutes after its founding in 1948, American presidents have supported the country, almost all unconditionally, except President George H.W. Bush, who in 1991 gave Israel an ultimatum to free settlements on Palestinian land in exchange for $10 billion in loan guarantees. That approach worked, but not all agree that restricting aid will affect change.
The emotive issue of providing for a country's means for their own defense can sometimes trigger different responses in different theaters. It's just been a sort of inexact tool for the U.S. in the past. And so I think that's internalized within this administration right now. And so I think that coupled with the president's longstanding commitment to Israel is why you haven't seen any real steps taken on this front.
President Joe Biden said in a statement he is outraged and heartbroken by the deaths of World Central Kitchen workers, his latest stern rebuke over Israel's war conduct. Still, he refuses to respond to the question many are asking.
Would you consider conditioning military aid?
Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News.
All right, VOA's Chris Casquejo joins us now with additional reporting live from the White House. Hi, Chris. President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu talked on the phone on Thursday. What did they talk about?
Good morning from Washington, D.C. Susan, that phone call between the two leaders can best be characterized as tense. President Biden emphasized that the strikes on humanitarian workers and the overall humanitarian situation in Gaza are unacceptable, and he's calling for Israel to take concrete, specific, and measurable steps to address civilian harm, humanitarian suffering, and the safety of aid workers. And he made clear that U.S. policy with respect to Gaza will be determined by our assessment of Israel's immediate action on these steps. And a growing number of Democratic lawmakers are calling on the president to condition military aid based on how Israel responds to this. Meanwhile, World Central Kitchen has demanded an independent investigation into those airstrikes that killed 7 of its staff in Gaza. Celebrity chef Jose Andres, who founded the food relief organization, said on Wednesday that the attack had targeted his workers systematically, car by car. Susan?
Chris, how is the Israel-Hamas conflict playing out on the presidential campaign trail here in the U.S.?
Pro-Palestinian protesters have disrupted several White House events and Biden campaign events around the country as Biden's constituents, including many Muslim and Arab Americans, have voiced their outrage. And they've made their message clear at the polls as hundreds of thousands have voted uncommitted in Democratic primary elections in various states. And the numbers kind of bear this out. A Pew survey released Thursday shows that only 36% of American Muslims view Biden positively. The same survey shows that only 6% believe that the U.S. is striking the right balance between the Israelis and Palestinians. And 60% of those surveyed say Biden favors the Israelis. Now, that same poll, we should note, shows that only 35%, so not much of a difference there, of American Muslims approve of Donald Trump's position on the issue.
Very interesting. Chris, stay with us. I'd like to get your thoughts on our next story as well. On a call on Tuesday, President Biden discussed with Chinese President Xi Jinping a range of high-level issues and reiterated his call that China not use web-based disinformation tools to interfere with the U.S. presidential election in 2024. The two leaders also discussed Taiwan, the island China claims as its own, as it prepares to inaugurate a new leader next month. VOA's Anita Powell reports from Washington.
The White House described Tuesday's phone call between President Joe Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping, which follows their in-person meeting last year, as candid and constructive. This time, the two covered a range of issues they had previously discussed in November, including joint counter-narcotics efforts, military communication, and the risks of artificial intelligence.
We believe that there is no substitute for regular communication at the leader level to effectively manage this complex and often tense bilateral relationship. And both presidents agreed to pick up the phone and speak when needed.
Xi, in a statement, said both leaders found the phone call to be candid and constructive. But he stressed that disagreements remain, notably about the status of Taiwan, which China claims. In his statement, Xi said the China-U.S. relationship is beginning to stabilize, and this is welcomed by both societies and the international community. On the other hand, the negative factors of the relationship have also been growing, and this requires attention from both sides. The White House said Biden reiterated, but did not advance, previous concerns about Chinese interference in the upcoming U.S. election. Xi did not mention the topic in his account of the call.
I would just say that we've been clear consistently, even going back to the November meeting in California, about our concerns over our own election security and efforts by certain actors, including some from the PRC, to affect that.
Just last month, the British Parliament voted to impose sanctions over Beijing-linked hacks of its Electoral Commission and Parliament. U.S. intelligence officials have also warned lawmakers that Chinese hackers are preparing to wreak havoc and cause real-world harm to the U.S. China's government last month showcased how it uses digital tools to bolster, not hamper, democracy. But analysts point to a state-sponsored Chinese influence campaign known as Spamouflage that does the opposite and encouraged Biden to push back.
There needs to be a very clear and some consistent communication about election interference. And I don't just mean hacking into voting systems, which in itself is obviously one of the most heavy-handed forms of election interference, but even the ones that involve manipulating public opinion in deceptive ways, or even just trying to discourage people from voting, which we have seen from operations that have been linked to China in the past.
The White House did not say when the two leaders would next speak, but Xi, in his statement, said he welcomed this week's visit to China by U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. Anita Powell, VOA News, Washington.
Chris, thanks for staying with us. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is in China for 5 days of talks. What's on her agenda?
Susan, the two largest economies in the world appear to be hashing out or continuing to hash out the rules on how to compete against each other. Yellen has recently accused China of flooding global markets with heavily subsidized green energy products, possibly undercutting the subsidies the U.S. has provided to its own renewable energy and EV sectors under the Inflation Reduction Act. And she reiterated those concerns about Chinese overcapacity, as she calls it, in one of her speeches today. She also didn't rule out taking additional steps to counter Chinese subsidies in the green energy sector. Susan?
Very interesting. And President Biden will host Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and Philippines President Fernando Marcos Jr. for a summit in Washington later this month. What's on that agenda? Do we know?
Well, that summit is happening next week after a state visit on Wednesday by Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. That trilateral summit between the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines will bring closer coordination on South China Sea issues. Both Japan and the Philippines have competing claims in that vast expanse of water, according to U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell. So we'll see what kind of agreements are hashed out among the three countries. And the Philippines ambassador to the U.S. also told some of us reporters on Wednesday that the country is looking to build upon U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo's visit to his country last month. Raimondo called for U.S. companies to help double the number, currently 13, of semiconductor manufacturing facilities in the Philippines. So while Janet Yellen says the U.S. is not looking to decouple from China, they are looking to move more of manufacturing in these key high-tech industries to more of its allies like the Philippines. Susan?
All right, Chris, thank you so much for all of that and have a great weekend. I'll talk to you soon. For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.